statement. The purpose of tonight's effort is to try to bring information to the activism community in particular at the local level on how we need to rethink how we engage at the federal level to get things done. In particular, understanding where the money goes, understanding how the systems of government interact with each other. And the benefit that we have this evening is that tonight we have Dr. J.J. Walcott with us, who's spent several years now within the Pentagon system doing research and development and writing a book on how all the government works and what those relationships are and where some of those gaps are. And so we've had opportunity to talk about how valuable those insights would be for our local community and the work that people are doing in the grassroots initiatives to be able to leverage this information and drive more of a unified voice at a federal level to make real change, particularly as we'll highlight some of the issues with Puerto Rico and other things. But that's tonight. J.J. Walcott, I'd like to welcome to the stage to begin that presentation.
All right. All right, everybody. So everybody has a card. I'm going to start by explaining the cards. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came about all of this information and why, and then what it is that we can do with it. The tutorial will be fairly intense. I've tried to avoid a full deep dive because I think it might make my brain hurt and everyone else's as well because it's fairly complex. But if you have questions at any point, please let me encourage you to ask them because there is a lot more information and I can answer those questions at any layer that we need to. So we've tried a little bit of an experiment today. As I mentioned, each of you has a card. And on that card is a position in the government. And if you don't know what it is that you have, I'm hoping Kim knows hers. Kim is our resident president for today. And always locally, yes. So our goal is to help you think from a different perspective, from the perspective of this type of individual. One of the characteristic things that we do in defense is to say, think like the enemy, because it allows you to see from that other perspective and anticipate any maneuver someone might make. Now, I'm not suggesting all of the government is your enemy. It is not. I know that there are pieces that might be, but certainly not the entire government. But it does allow us to better connect and better anticipate how does this system work? Where might we be able to infiltrate in positive ways? One of the common phrases I use is that a weapon can be used to harm or defend. And the only difference is the person holding it. And so in this case, that weapon is information. We often talk about who you know, how much money you have, how far into the politics you are, but sometimes what you know becomes just as important. And it's not necessarily the loudest voices that oftentimes make impact, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. How I came about all of this information. Some of you have heard me speak before and say that 2016 was an eventful time for all of us. And for me in particular, I found that it inspired me, is the word I like to use. It inspired me to get more involved, to get more answers to questions that I had. I am a scientist to my core. I am one of those people who loves to be in the lab and answering hard problems that are very complicated and that we don't know answers to. And so when I saw all of this happening, I felt very compelled to get involved and find the answers that didn't make sense to me. Why is it that we have politicians that tell us answers over and over and over again, and then every 4 years we are left asking, I didn't see that happen. And I thought, there can't be the case that every politician is really as corrupt as we sometimes paint them to be. So there must be other information. There must be other things happening. There must be more to this. We also hear about sloths, right? The characteristic description of a government employee. Someone who moves paper slowly through a system, checks in at 8, checks out at 5, doesn't care what they do. We see it depicted in movies. We see it even in cartoons. It was in Zootopia. Certainly they characterized them as sloths. I thought, really? That many millions of people are just moving slowly, I wanted to know firsthand. So I went into government 2016. I literally started the same day as the current administration, the Tuesday after the election. I even swore in next to a gentleman whose last name was President, so they kept telling me I was swearing in next to Mr. President, which just made the story even funnier in my book. But I spent the last several years gathering all of this information and doing what I do best, compiling it, connecting it, and making sense of it. And now I'm going to start sharing it with everyone. You have to leave in order to share it. That's one of the big punchlines. You cannot ethically share all this information while you're still a government employee, so it required me to leave. And so, without further ado, does anyone have any questions on those points so far? All right, well then let's go ahead and get started. Neil, if you may as well, go ahead and... All right, so sticking with the... Oh yeah, why don't we go ahead and turn off the light here? I'm sorry, you can write on anything you like. We just want to make sure that we have the information as far as the positions go. So sticking with the Women's March goals, we have two sections to this. The first is to educate, and the second is to activate. And so in the education section, this is basically a tutorial of how the executive branch works. And then when we get to the activate section, it'll be on all of you to get involved and come up with ideas and really make this concrete. It doesn't do us any good to speak in the nebulous level. We need a little bit of theory, but we don't need a lot of it. What we really need are solutions, ideas, plans, and things that we can start doing to execute. Where do you put your money when you want to support a candidate? What are you looking for in somebody that you want to encourage up? These are the questions that we want to be able to answer. So this is actually the front of one of my 2 books that I published in government. And I think it fits for this talk really well because the purpose was to say, how do we generate ideas that we can use to innovate in the executive branch so that we can have a new way of looking at things? Go ahead. So segment 1, we have 3 segments in the tutorial. This is going to be an overview of the executive branch. Wow, isn't that busy? It's busy, it's complicated, it's deep, it's not to scale. It's intended to be a whiteboard. It's intended to be all the information we gathered on the screen. I will tell you this is actually much cleaner than what we had in the lab. In the lab, I had a room about half the size of this, and every single wall was filled with sticky notes gathering information. We had pictures of appointees and cabinet members and presidents, and we had to keep changing them because people kept leaving.
Should we pause and allow people to decide if you want to move forward? If you think you want to get a better view, you're welcome to move forward.
Is this going to be available to us?
Sure, yeah, absolutely, we sure can. So the point of this picture is really just to tell you it's very, very busy. So now we're going to break it down. Go ahead. Because what I find is that this is the reaction I get most of the time, especially from the young people. Just make it stop, please. There's too much information. Why is this a problem? This is a problem because what happens then in our country is people say, I don't want to watch the news anymore. And I can't blame them. It's exhausting. There is so much negativity right now. And so we have a lot of folks saying, okay, I'm only going to pay attention to what I know, what is clear, and what is easy for me to digest. And actually, when we look at theories on how the mind works, that's exactly what happens when you become overwhelmed. And so this is starting to happen to our country, and it's problematic. So we need to better understand that at a level that is digestible. Next slide. Go ahead. So let's talk about each of the pieces. First one is the president. We all know, now this was red to depict the Republicans because that's who's in office right now, but the color scheme doesn't work with the projector. So imagine.
It's 2020.
Yes, yes. But we've got a little bit slightly blue, right? So we've got the president. Go ahead. All right, and then we've got Congress, right? Now we need to keep in mind because we hear a lot of times with people on the news and folks who are running for president, they talk a lot about over here, but this is the job over here and it's very different, and I want to talk about that. Next one. All right, and then we've got the executive branch and the Department of Defense. So the reason these are gray is to point out and emphasize the fact that they are nonpartisan. It's very important to understand these are nonpartisan because this is getting work done, but it is not from a political perspective. And the size of these is significantly bigger, even taking into account the power these two groups have. There are 4.5 million people between those two other, and there are 552 across here. Wow, that's a huge number. So even though these folks have decision-making power, so too do the folks in this other, in these other groups. Next one. Now, how is it that they talk to each other? A lot of times we hear on TV about the president's budget, but it is just a proposal. So when they say something like, we're going to cut money to special needs kids, that's just a proposal. That doesn't mean that Congress is going to approve it. When they say we're going to spend enormous amounts of money on defense, that doesn't mean it's going to get approved either. So this proposal is meaningful from the perspective of how the president is going to justify and ask Congress for approval for the things that he or she believes need to happen. But it is by no means a guarantee. Next one. So the way Congress formally speaks back is to say, yeah, we heard you, but we didn't really agree, so we're going to do it differently. This is how we allocate money. Now, a couple of points about this. This is actually the only real formal way and legal way that they speak to each other. You can, of course, send tweets, and you can get on TV, and you can meet with Congress and share, hey, this is why I want to spend the money here. This is why we think this program needs to be supported. But that's not required, and it is oftentimes not used. There is also sometimes backdoor deals that occur, and we don't see any of those. Yes, a lot of that happens. But this is the formal communication that is actually documented, and this is the way that they speak. One other point that I think is really important to understand, it is not very clear how this money is allocated. So by way of example, I worked in a program called Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative under the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And our congressional mandate was to, quote, modernize learning. Well, how do you do that? Do you spend money on computers for kids? I mean, we're coming out of the Defense Department. Should we do that? Do you fund STEM? Do you write a book? Do you teach classes? Do you hold conferences? It's not clear. So when we hear something like a wall, you get a budget for border security. In this case, I believe it was $22 billion this year. If your wall only costs $7 billion, you can just buy it. So a lot of people wonder, well, why in the world do you go back to Congress and argue it? Because you don't have to. That's the point. On the inside, anyone who knows how the budget works knows you do not actually have to ask Congress to clarify each and every expenditure. It's a general budget, which means you have a ton of power in deciding how that actually gets allocated, but it also means the folks down here, especially in the executive branch, the other 14 departments, and in the Pentagon, have an enormous amount of power in making those decisions because those decisions funnel down. And so those are areas that are highly under-tapped. Go ahead. Now, the president's next job is to do the strategy documents. So this is the National Defense Strategy, the National Security Strategy, and what's being written now, the National Space Strategy. And there are a couple others as well. But again, these are the primary formal documents. Has anyone read them? Has anyone ever seen them before? So for defense, they come in two versions. One is going to be a short version that anyone can read because it's unclassified. The other version is going to be classified, and not everybody gets access to that, and that's going to be longer. But these are strategy documents. So they don't have specific plans. They don't tell you specifically how to spend money. They don't clarify how it is that you're going to actually make those decisions. They're very broad. They are things like, China is our #1 enemy. Okay, what do we do with that? Lots and lots of decisions down the chain. Next one. To the executive branch, we have a document called the President's Management Agenda. And this also is extremely broad. It'll say things like, improve IT systems without much clarification. It'll say things like, ensure that work is done efficiently. Okay, one of my responses to that was, are you telling us all to do a good job? Hopefully we are doing a good job anyway. I mean, that should be an assumption. But those are the kinds of documents that come down. Yes, ma'am?
I mean, I know who the Pentagon is, but I don't know who makes up the executive branch.
Yes, so that's going to be your 15 departments and your agencies.
An example of one?
HUD, Housing and Urban
Okay.
Development,
Okay.
Department of Education, Department of Transportation, Department of Treasury, on and so forth. And we'll work
So
our
you
way
have
down to that.
That's basically your
Yes.
cabinet,
I'm sorry?
departments that
Yep.
relate to the cabinet.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yes, sir.
When you get to the judicial.
No, we won't do as much with the
That's
judicial.
larger than
The
the Congress, easily.
judicial branch? The
As far as the number of people, sure.
not
The
with it.
number of employees?
Number of
If you consider all
federal
the
employees,
judges?
attorneys.
You're talking about across, yes, but their function is very different, right? They're overseeing the legalities of the system, and what we're looking at are the decision-making power that exists that we all can affect. So it's a little bit different. It's very hard. You have to have special training in order to go into the judicial branch, and so our ability from an activism perspective to affect that substantially is going to be much more minimal. Certainly, you can encourage those who are attorneys to get involved, but that's a substantial extra layer beyond where we are on this point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like ACLU.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, next one. Now, what this doesn't take into account are some of the things we don't hear about very often. We do hear about our international community, but we don't hear a lot about how they interact with our system. But they interact substantially. Next one. So the way that we formally connect with them is going to be through the United Nations, NATO. NATO is going to be for defense. Summits are going to be your meetings, memoranda, and agreements. So those are not just formally signed, though, by the president. Even in the executive branch, there are many folks who are authorized to have those conversations, make those decisions, sign those agreements, go to those meetings. I was a U.S. delegate to NATO, and we made decisions. We were the lead nation. We were the ones sitting there deciding what the agenda was, what agreements were going to be had, how we were going to move that information, and what was going to be accomplished. So there is substantial power all the way through for this international piece. What it also means is that the international groups affect us, right? So they're talking to us about what they see happening in the world and what they are interpreting from the U.S. and what they want to do to be able to interact better. And again, at every layer down. Go ahead. But what's left out of all of this, which I find really interesting, is the country. We don't talk, we're the ones paying for all of this, and we are supposed to be the recipients of everything, and yet we are not in this structure at all, and that is extremely meaningful. That cannot be overemphasized. There is no specific way for information to come from our people upward. Go ahead. And the only legal way, now again, we can tweet, we can talk on TV, we can have meetings with people, but the legal way we connect is through this State of the Union address, which, as you all know, happens once a year for about an hour to 3 hours, depending on how it is, and it's a show, right? It doesn't necessarily give us the information, nor does it deliver services that we might expect to see. But this is the way it does. There's no obligation to do all those other services, except for what's agreed upon in the budget. But again, you can completely choose how you do that. And so it changes a lot. There's one other group that is not present here that is very, very impactful, and one of them that I think might be useful to us. Go ahead. Advisory boards. Has anyone heard of these advisory boards? So there was a lot of talk when this administration came on board because a number of the advisory boards disbanded because they were frustrated. It's very, very meaningful. So these advisory boards can be created, again, at any layer and at any level. There is a rule: you cannot donate your time to the government, but you can participate in an advisory board. And guess what happens when you participate in an advisory board? You are making recommendations about how commerce should happen, how the economy should change, who should be getting jobs, which companies might need to get funding for contracts, how different ideas might need to be circulated, what needs to go into these strategy documents. The influence of these boards can be huge. And they can make recommendations to both the president and to Congress. Go ahead. So all of this information can be fed this direction. What I don't see very often is information fed the other direction, but we did. When we did we basically wrote the National Education Strategy, which was just published a couple weeks ago. And I took advantage of this concept because I realized there was major power in this. Why? Because when we were facilitating a change, I realized that whenever the administration turns over, you lose all the work that was done for that 4 years because the new person that comes in wants to change it. But on the other hand, if this advisory board is made up of people who have their own funds, their own impetus for change, their own willingness to get energized and do work, then it doesn't matter if you're fully involved in all of it. What you did is facilitate a plan that they're going to execute independently. That is the proper way to use an advisory board. But too often the way it's used is to give information, which we'd like to believe is mostly for altruistic reasons to help the nation. You might imagine the possibility of abuse of it though. Go ahead. These yellow lines represent things that are underutilized. So, if you're in Congress, yes sir.
So, can corporate leaders become part of the advisory boards?
They are primarily the advisory board.
They end up
They are. I mean, that is a really important point to emphasize. Yes, yes. So it frequently is going to be your leaders of big businesses or ones who are, I'm not going to say activists, but lobbyists, but.
So is ALEC part of the advisory boards that try to get these their legislation into Congress?
So there are rules about lobbyists, and lobbyists cannot be here. And a lobbyist is actually a registered person. You have to actually legally register as a lobbyist. But what's interesting is you'll have groups that have a side group that are registered lobbyists, and the other side is not. And the other side that is not can be part of this. So it gets gray, right? So whether it's business or it's nonprofits or it's activism, you can get into this space. And again, the purpose is to help, but the potential, of course, is to go the other way. Now, one of the things that I found really problematic is where these yellow lines are. Now, I'm purposefully leaving this up as messy because I want to show you something about this. Things that are missing are as important as things that are present. So Congress, the only way they talk to the country is through the media. But what is their motivation? Right. So if your motivation is re-election, what are you telling people?
Whatever they want to hear.
Right, so it's what's happening on TV and how do I react to it? How many times are you going to hear what they paid for over here and what that developed? Only unless it's particularly useful in their area, right? The other thing we don't see happening very often is the executive branch sharing information for the Congress. Now, this is incredibly meaningful. There is a pathway, which is why I made this yellow instead of red, because it's not non-existent, it's just not common. You have to go through something called legislative affairs. Now, understood, because they want to hold ethics rules in place. However, it means you have to ask legislative affairs to get involved. You have to convince your boss that it is that you want to share information. You have to package it in such a way that it'll get maneuvered over there. You have to get in a queue to make it happen. Consequently, what do you think most people do?
It doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen. And so, I always like to use the example of circus animals. So Congress decides circus animals are something we really, really, really want to focus on. And they decide to fund a program in the executive branch that is going to research circus animals. We're going to look at their safety. We're going to look at what they eat. We're going to look at how we can make sure that their lives are better. Okay, so we spend all that money. We researched all that information. Now it comes to a vote on what we're going to do with laws. But what didn't happen?
Dialogue.
That's right. The information didn't get back. And so these folks end up making decisions in absence of the information that was gathered that we paid for. I could not, this is one that really surprised me. We sat in a lot of meetings with staffers, and they said, yeah, we don't talk to people. We just don't talk to the executive branch. And we thought, oh my goodness, how is that possible? You paid for us to do this. Don't you want to know what we built? And then we got invited to this moment on the Hill. And they said, we want to learn all about these programs that are similar to each other. And we're going to invite the Senate and the House of Representatives to come and talk to you all. So it was kind of like a science fair where you get a booth and you get to provide some piece of information. So who has a GS-15? All right, so you would be the head of a program as a GS-15. And if you have a program that you know that Congress is funding and they say they're going to come look at your program, what are you going to show them about your circus animal program?
I would think, what is it that has been a concern for us? And how are we going to address our concern, what we have identified as a concern?
I love it. That's exactly what I did, and we were wrong. You know what everyone else did? They showed up with maps of the United States, and they highlighted where they spent money on contractors, so that when the Congress members showed up, they walked through the halls to find who had a star on their state and on their location, and that is who they talked to. And they had one question on their mind: did you spend how many dollars in my district? And how many dollars did you save the country? And so people actually had tickers that showed how much this intervention would save. And they just walked away with those two numbers: amount of money spent in the district, how much money saved overall. Big lesson to me. The goal was not necessarily to show off the results. And I said, okay, different game. All right, next one. Now, this is the one that never happens. This was red, but I can't show red on here today. So from Congress to the executive branch is not shared. Why is that meaningful? Who's in the House and the Senate? Who are my House and Senate people?
Oh, I'm in the Senate.
All right, we've got three House and Senate. Two House and one Senate. All right, so you're going to allocate money to this circus program. Wouldn't you like to tell the folks who are going to be doing it what you want to know? Wouldn't you want to know what their skill sets are? Are they qualified to do this work? Would you maybe want to tell them to spend money in your district? Right? Would you want at least a punchline at the end that you can say, I voted for this, and this is what we got out of it? But you don't know who you have at your fingertips. You don't know what capabilities they have. You don't get to tell them what it is you're looking for. All you get to say is research circus animals. Or, of course, whatever it is. This is my example. Imagine where that starts to fall apart. The other one that doesn't happen is this one here, the executive branch to the nation. This is actually considered unethical unless it is approved. One of the questions that I often asked is, who is government? You hired me to be an expert, and then you send me to these meetings, and then you tell me, don't have an opinion. Well, then who's having an opinion? Well, if you have an opinion, you need to send it through general counsel so they can approve your opinion. You know who the opinions are? You know who government is? It's the attorneys. Because the person who controls the information is the person, or group in this case, that is actually the representative. How is it that if I'm an expert in something, whatever it is, in my case it's education and psychology, but how is it the attorney knows whether or not my answer is an A+ answer, a B- answer, D-? How do they know?
They don't.
They don't. So what are they looking for? The attorneys in the Department of Defense are completely different than the attorneys in the other departments. In defense, because law is always interpretable, number one goal is to make sure that we help and support and create readiness for and protect our warfighters. So everything that the experts bring, we say, yes, let's make sure that we bring all that goodness to our warfighters. But in the other departments, what are they afraid of?
Getting shut down or fired?
Scandal, yes. So what is the answer always? Nope, don't say anything. don't share information. Getting information out is incredibly difficult. So that feeling that we all kind of have that our taxpayer dollars are going somewhere into this oblivion and we don't really know how they're being spent is a very fair feeling. It is the case that people are working their tails off, but their ability to share it is hindered by the rules and regulations that exist. And they change per administration. So under this administration, there is a lot more lockdown. In fact, under Office of Personnel Management, I had a 30-day committee review requirement for one tweet. So how many times do you think I tweeted? 0. But under defense, I had a full Twitter, and I was able to share all the great work that we were doing. Different departments, different rules. But that came through, and that changes per administration. So that does not have to continue. We can make that change. Next slide. So I really like this point because what you saw was chaos, right? There's information going this way and that way and this way and that way, but what you might have missed is where information wasn't going. And when there's that much happening, guess what happens to the person who knows the system really, really well? Wants to make something happen and doesn't advertise it.
It gets done.
That's right. Has anybody seen the recent movie about Dick Cheney? Oh, God. Yeah, and what did you get from that?
He's such a piece of shit.
Okay.
Very stealthy, right? He's very stealthy.
He's quiet. Right? And I said to my family, I said, I can't verify any of the stuff because I wasn't there during that time, but what I can confirm is that concept is completely legitimate. You do not have to be the loudest in the room to make things happen, and frequently it is the quietest in the room who's maneuvering things. And when you understand that, you know what you're looking for. I have a term, I shared it with my boss in the Pentagon like the second to last day I was there. I said, sir, you got to watch out for the people who are moving coconuts. And he said, what? I said, the people that are really busy, that are moving stuff around, but nothing ever seems to happen, we call that moving coconuts. Next slide. So, how then, given the fear of those who've been in here for a long time, and especially those who are in Congress, when you are afraid that bad things can happen due to this chaos, what do? Sorry? What?
Join the chaos.
Ah, that's what I did. That's not what we typically do, though. Anyone else know what we tend to
Avoid.
Oh, she said join the chaos.
Join the chaos.
Which is basically what I did, right? I jumped off a cliff and said, I'm going to figure this out because it's not making sense to me. What typically happens, go ahead, is we make rules. We make more and more and more and more rules. So here, I call it regulating fairness because we're going to make sure that everything works properly. We're going to add another rule and another rule, and we're going to talk to the country. Remember, if you're in the Senate or you're in the House, what you're trying to do is tell people you're making rules to ensure bad things don't happen. So you add to these rules. This is actually the Federal Acquisition Regulations, the FAR. It is a book about this thick. The paper is super thin. The writing is very small. And let me tell you what doesn't happen. It does not make anything fair. Why? Because the only people who can deal with this monstrosity are those who already have enough money to pay somebody to know all these rules, or who like game playing enough and have spent enough time learning them that they stick with it enough to work around them. The rules don't stop all of the possible things that could go wrong from happening. What they do is reduce the pool of the people who are willing to participate. It ends up creating the opposite effect. This is a really important point because this is the way we keep dealing with things. And this is just one example. There are mountains of paper of rules, but those rules actually keep many of us from participating because unless you just have enough stamina, you get too tired to keep going, and it creates problems. Go ahead. So let's get to this department question, this strategic level, right? The tactical level is going to be all the workers at the GS-15 and lower, and I'll explain that in a minute. But this is at the strategic level. Go ahead. Go ahead. Now I've got up here the word top-down. Does everyone know the difference between top-down and bottom-up? Right? So top-down, you've got a leader and that shares information down. Yes, ma'am?
Bottom up.
And then bottom-up, yes, is more of our grassroots concept, right? So right now we have a top-down. So we've got the president. The number's already come up. That's the office of the White House. There are 1,800 people that work in it. Are you surprised? I was surprised. 1,800 is a huge number of folks working in the White House. Go ahead. And of course, then we've got Congress, and we already know that we have the approved budget. Go ahead. And here we've got 535 people. So when we combine these, we have more than the 552 I talked about. But really, I'm talking about the president, the vice president, and the 15 cabinet members. Go ahead. Now, these represent all of the cabinets that exist, right? So we have 14 here. This is going to be your executive branch. DOD proper is part of the executive branch, but the active duty and reservists are going to be extra. So each one of these represents one person. So is anybody here a cabinet member? Yep, so we've got 2 cabinet members. Which ones are you? You're under HUD. Great, you're completely qualified. I don't even know what you do, but I already know you're qualified, right?
You're breathing.
You're breathing. But this makes sense. I mean, this is actually a real thing. Have you ever worked in housing before, sir?
No.
No. So how do you get qualified to be the secretary of HUD? Friends with the president, that's right. That's one way to do it. What's another way to do it? Money, right? Because you want to keep...
Yeah.
This is not only true for the cabinet members. This goes down a layer as well. So this is very meaningful because when you have folks that are at this level who do not have expertise in the area in which they are overseeing, we're back to that problem that I mentioned earlier. Does the person delivering the recommendations have an A+ answer, a B- answer, a D answer? Do you know, sir, the difference between a great housing plan, a pretty good one, a piss poor one? How would you make those decisions? It's kind of like, you know, how some people bet on the Super Bowl and all of the games prior to based on the colors of the uniforms instead of based on actual football skills. You know, some of us have been guilty of that, but it's okay because it's, you know, it's $10-15 money, you know, it's $10-15. It's not a big deal. But when you're doing that at this level, my goodness, that should concern you greatly. And this is prevalent. We hear about this part in the news. What we don't hear about is the next layer. Now, this one's really important. Go ahead. See this line? It's not white. There's a reason. Does anyone know why the agencies is written separately? So this is going to be things like Office of Personnel Management, GSA, FBI. These are independent agencies. This is actually a really important point. So recently we've heard in the news that some of these agencies are getting consolidated. And you might hear the words, well, this will make it more efficient. We'll have fewer departments. We'll have fewer things to be spending money on. We'll have smaller government. No, you know what we're doing? We are putting them under the president so that we are consolidating power. That is why you hear some people on TV who are saying, I'm not in agreement with him or her, or I'm not in agreement with this administration or that administration. It doesn't have to just be the current one. It can be anyone. These are intended to be independent for a reason. It is part of our checks and balances. So when this gets changed, and the way it's getting changed is through legal loopholes, when it gets changed, then it creates that power. And what happens is then you can control that power in different ways. Now, what are the ways that they're combining OPM and GSA? OPM deals with people, GSA deals with money. You can't just connect them and you can't just subsume them. However, the director of OPM can choose to be subsumed under GSA. So what do? You take the deputy director, make that person the director, and inform them to choose. So that's exactly what happened, and that becomes then a legal decision because legally approved. Go ahead. So right below this then, we have 4,000 appointees. This is a really important space as well. Now again, how are these, who's my appointees? I think I've got some appointees back here somewhere. Are you an appointee? Okay.
Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense.
Okay, great. Do you know anything about defense?
Well, I'm an Air Force brat.
You are extremely qualified. Thank you so much.
Retired Navy.
That puts you well into the space. I do, in defense, we vet a little bit more, but you've not actually served, correct? And you've not done a support status role like in research or engineering or anything like that. Never worked at a strategic military level, correct?
I lived on a SAC base, though.
So what I would consider you somebody who understands military culture, but maybe doesn't understand strategic military decision making. But you would be qualified for the position that you have right there. That should concern you, right? Right. No offense intended, of course, right? We have had situations where we had individuals who maybe had budgeting experience in the past, who know nothing about military. At one point, we had somebody who was like 28 years old and an attorney who had no experience in military before and was at actually a level above you, making decisions. So what do you think those people do? They don't make decisions necessarily based on defense then, right? They're making decisions based on business practices they're familiar with. So it might be things like no travel, or make sure that your Excel spreadsheets are correct. What about that strategic vision and what it is that you're supposed to be doing? So there's a lot of wiggle room and a lot of space in there, but a lot of deals are made. Did you have a question?
No, isn't like Mattis was just replaced by a Boeing person.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
I mean, he's not a military person.
Correct. Now, I will say, so something interesting about Secretary of Defense, it would seem typically, without additional information, logical to have a military person there, but that is actually atypical. So Secretary Mattis actually had to have a waiver because he was not out for, I believe, 7 years is the requirement. Now, this one was granted, I believe, because A, he is a tremendous human being, a tremendous leader for military, but also it was one of those things where there was bipartisan support. Everybody wanted to feel comfortable here, and there's no question. I had to speak for him when I spoke overseas, and I cannot say enough positive things. He was fantastic. He was fantastic in his role. I'm very grateful for the service that he had, but he is atypical. Typically, the Secretary of Defense is considered the civilian complement lead. So somebody like me would be more common. I have worked at strategic military level. I've been supporting military through research for many, many years. I've been to covered all services. So I would be a civilian complement because I understand the culture, but I also understand all the decision making, but I haven't served. And that again is a checks and balance because we want people who understand and recognize the necessity to know what it's like to be in theater, boots on the ground. But when you have only that at the table, you miss out on these civilian knowledge points as well. So what we want is that complement. All right, so next slide. Or next one. All right, so now all of these folks. Yes. Oh, yes, ma'am.
So are you saying that you want young people to be in government? So are you saying that the appointees is the path of least resistance?
It's one of the ways in, but young would have a very hard time here. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It's just that there's some life experience. This is a lot of gameplay right here in the appointee space. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of power negotiation, and I'm not sure someone under 30 is the strongest choice, but it does happen. Someone in the 22 to 23 range is probably not. I hope they don't appoint to that level. Yes, sir.
In this administration, there's no real tie-in with experience and or expertise or anything like that in the position. How about in previous administrations?
So yeah, that's the interesting point. So I will actually say that the gentleman that I reported to, and I reported up the political chain, so I worked directly with the appointees, and I worked with them across the departments. I will actually say that it's not entirely the case that they're all not knowledgeable. We certainly know that there are some cabinet members that are not knowledgeable about their area that they're overseeing, but when you go down to the appointee level, there are many. It's just not pervasive. Right? It's not everybody that's qualified for that position, but there are many that are. And the person I reported to I thought was fantastic. Was very, very knowledgeable, and I knew many others that were as well. What I saw in the other administration, actually the person I was speaking about that was 28 and an attorney who knew nothing, that was from the Obama administration. So this is a common thing. This is not just this current administration. And the way this works typically is that all these people go to a think tank when the opposing party is in office, and when the party that they are affiliated with comes into office, they all come back in. And so when that happens, that in some ways actually is good, because it means that constantly you are aware of how government works, but it also has cost because it just means you're moving people in and out. Yeah.
My dad was a HUD appointee,
Mhm.
and it was because he volunteered and donated to Jack Kemp's campaign, and that was a strategic plan by Bush.
Yep.
He knew nothing of that area.
And it's common. So what do you think their ability to translate information is to these folks? Not good. Keep going. All right, so where does the power exist? Go ahead. So that looked like there was a lot of power at the top, but let me point out, this little sliver right here represents the entire top. Go ahead. So that's 552 leaders, and then the 4,000 appointees. But this, go ahead, this represents, in comparison, the 2.4 million workers. So where do you think that power lies, or at least a very large part of it, down in this space? And how much activism do we do into this space? How many people do we talk to in this space? None. And a lot of people say, oh, but they all live in DC. No, they don't. 20% live in DC. 80% live outside. Unbeknownst to, I'm sure, everyone in the room and everyone that I talk to in our political sphere, I've been representing the state of Florida and DC for the last several years. When I go to the Pentagon, why do you think I know that we have $12 billion in military money coming to the I-4 corridor? Why do you think I'm standing in the Pentagon saying to people, you know why you want to keep funding Florida? Because we have something nobody else has. And I know that because I wrote the paper on it, right? So we work with Orange County Economic Development and their partnership. We work with the Pentagon. We have power by having people in these spaces who we don't even know they exist, because they don't put me on TV, right? And nobody knows I take this job, and yet the impact that I have and the experience gained is enormous. A lot of folks don't realize Orlando is literally the world's hub for modeling and simulation. So there I am at the NATO meeting in Switzerland, and the lead general says, who's the US delegate? And I raised my hand. He says, I know the United States is a big country, but, and I thought, oh, here we go. Oh, here we go. He says, but you don't by any chance know Colonel Walt Yates, do you? I said, oh, not only do I know him, I mentor his daughter. He lives down the street from me. Why? Because Orlando is known worldwide for the work that we do here. And so speaking for that matters. It matters substantially, because modeling and simulation is not just for military. This is going to be what we wrote into the National Education Strategy. This is what is going to help change this country for the economy, for setting up for automation that's coming, being able to interact globally. There's so much here, and we don't realize that having a voice in Washington at various levels matters. Yes, ma'am?
Well, why?
Why what?
Why is Orlando so good for modeling and simulation?
So we were, we had a Navy base here. You're too young to probably remember that. But we had a BRAC, so it was closed. And so we had Disney, and we had the university, which, again, when you were very young, was just this crappy little commuter school that nobody really attended. So we had all of this money going into the arts programs and into the innovation that was coming out of UCF. And in the middle, they said, what are we going to do with these military groups? And they decided to do modeling and simulation, because it brought all of those industries together. It created a whole bunch of work for the university, it created a whole bunch of work for all of the folks in the entertainment industry, and it created a research hub for military, so that our military families, the state of Florida is actually second for military families in the country. We have substantial presence. Yes, sir?
Just to kind of reinforce what you were saying about the people at the lower level, there's an administrator out at UCF that was supposed to be working together with the military people in the research part, and he was having to deal with I think it was a captain or a colonel maybe, and he was kind of upset that this is such a lower level person, but that was the person who was making the decisions.
Oh, yeah.
So they wound up replacing the administrator.
Yeah.
And putting somebody
Yep.
in there that would work.
Yep. We do have a general lead here in Orlando, but mostly, so at the Navy, it's the captain is the highest ranking. And I was the representative from the Office of Secretary of Defense. So any decision made here locally, I made it. So yeah, you don't realize how much power there is, but there's quite a bit, actually. Go ahead, next slide. So this again is kind of, as we look at these points, how do these actually work? Go ahead. So as I like to say, the game of telephone does not work. Go ahead. How does the information get lost? Well, we saw a lot of places where it could get lost, right? We saw how it filters through, it gets misunderstood, it gets watered down, it doesn't get shared at all. Go ahead. And how does that affect the delivery of goods and services? So as we think about Puerto Rico, see how this money starts to fall apart? Go ahead. So here's
91 billion, what are you talking about?
I know. We're gonna get there. We're gonna get there. So
I can't breathe now.
I know.
right. So we have Congress, right, and we've got the president, and the secretaries. All right. Then we've got the appointees. Now, who's in my GS scale? Right. We got a 15. You're gonna be up in this space. So you're making quite a bit of decisions. Do we have a 5? GS 5. These folks are gonna be down here. Okay. So next. Go ahead. This is who we talk to when we have activism, right? This is who we yell at. We say, hey, we need you guys to listen to us. But who's making the decision? Go ahead. That guy down there. Okay? This is who we're talking to. That's who's delivering.
And who never talks to that person.
You got it. There is no connection here whatsoever. Go ahead. And then this is where our advisory boards are. Don't forget those, right? They're talking to the president. They're talking to the appointees. They're talking to the GS scale. How many times do we preach to our advisory board members? How many times do we try to get somebody on those advisory boards? We don't. But how much power do you think they have?
Well, we need to know who they are.
Yeah.
Need to know the boards to get onto. This is about the knowledge being mattering, right? Go ahead. Okay, now you've got your contractors. This is a big one, right? Who am I choose? All these people choose which contractor to spend money on. A lot of power in this range to decide where that gets spent. And then guess what? They give information here. Now, what if it's A+ information, or C information, or D- information? If you don't know the difference, you just get a report. But those folks are making 4 to 10 times what I pay this guy here. So when we say we want to have smaller government, well, it means 2 things, right? Fewer rules, but it can also mean fewer people. But guess what? It's cheaper to have government employees than it is to pay contractors who just deliver a report and never actually make sure it happens. Next. And then guess what the contractors do? Oh, here's the line. Who are they getting mad at if their money gets cut?
Lobbyists? Are they lobbyists?
No, these are the Congress. They can call their local Congress member and say, hey, you are going to cut a program I'm getting funded by. So in our case, we had a budget error, and folks who were getting funded called the local congresswoman and said, hey, if you don't fix this error, we're not going to get paid. Well, don't you know, it got fixed. Now, this was a good move because we were spending it wisely, but what if we weren't, right? There's always the possibility. But let's take something different. Let's say you want to have free education for everybody, but you live in a state that has Phoenix program, the online program. And now everybody's going to get free education. They're not going to be using the low-cost one. Guess who they're calling? And guess what's not going to happen? Guess what's not going to get approved? Because that's a big enough point that it can get pulled off the budget. The lower-level stuff, the intricacies, those get decided down there, but the big payments up here. So you won't see those happen no matter how many presidential candidates say it isn't going to happen. Go ahead. So, how do all these decisions affect tasking, actions, impact? You might imagine if you're in that lower echelon, you have to still feel good about yourself, right? Because you're making 75 cents on the dollar. You're paying your contractors 4 to 10 times what you're making. You have no power. You get no credit for anything you do. You don't get to be on TV. You don't get to tell anybody what you did. Why in the world are you working this job? What makes you stay in?
Security.
Partly security, but honestly, the young people, it's not the same anymore. People come in like me who want to change the world, and they get there and go, okay, maybe not, right? So what happens is people create systems inside to define their own power. And I like to say the power is defined in the Pentagon by how much money you control and how many 1-pound burritos you can eat. Go ahead. This is my little burrito sign. But what it means, the 1-pound burrito is an actual thing. And what it means is anybody who knows what the 1-pound burrito is, when you're walking the halls and you yell out the pound or how close you were, we all know you're somebody in the know. So even if we've changed over, we know you're part of the system of movement. So when I need something done, who am I talking to? The guy that just came in that's green that has no idea what's going on? Or am I talking to the guy who I know knows the system, who can move the piece of paper here and there and everywhere and we get stuff done? This is how power happens. Go ahead. So let's take an example. Where is Puerto Rico's disaster relief money? You're right. Someone said $91 billion, and I believe it's actually 11. Yes, it is actually 11. Go ahead. Where did the money go? Right? So these guys approve something. That guy has to decide, am I buying water? Am I paying for electricity? Which part of Puerto Rico is it going to? How fast am I going to move it? I don't know. Because you know what? Maybe I don't know that area. Maybe I've never lived through a hurricane. Maybe I don't realize that going 2 weeks without power is painful. But what if you... Or 8 months. Right? But the reason I say 2 weeks is because I think most people know no power for 8 months is painful. But I don't think people realize how painful 2 weeks is. And so you don't feel that impetus to move quickly, do you? Because you're the guy who actually has to make it happen. And you have a stack of other things to get done first. So it's just a queue of stuff. But what if you have somebody like me in there? Because I've lived through many hurricanes. I know what that's like. I have had to move out of my house and gut it. I just finished a $70,000 remodel of my kitchen, which actually will be finished tomorrow from the last one. I know what it's like. So how fast do you think I'm going to move if I'm this guy? I'm going to be pushing it fast. I'm going to find everybody with those burritos and move information. I'm going to get stuff spent. Having somebody here matters, even though we almost never talk about putting people there. Go ahead. Go ahead. Oh. All right, so number one thing I hope you learn about presidential candidates. We build programs. We do not do platforms. When they talk to you about the laws they're going to pass or the preferences they have, that is not the job. And if that's the job they're doing, guess what they're not doing? Managing all of those people and all those programs. They're arguing with Congress instead. That is not the job. Next, go ahead. So let's take an example. This is the Department of Education. This is not my graphic. This is straight offline. These are all the offices. So let's go through them. Office of Finance and Operations. Go ahead. That has nothing to do with education. That has to do with business practices on the inside. Office of the Chief Information Officer. Go ahead. Not about education inside. All right, here we've got 3. Elementary and secondary ed, English language, acquisition, and education rehabilitative services. These have to do with education, but what do? They get to choose. Institute of Educational Science, that's going to be your research arm. Love these people, but they're a very small group, right? Office of the Inspector General. Go ahead. That's an inside. That's not doing anything. Office of Civil Rights. Important for education, but do you think that should be separate for education, or should that be a general thing across all of them? Planning Evaluation Policy. Again, on the fence, but really about evaluation of schools. General Counsel, this is legal. Go ahead. That's not going to do anything. Legislation and Congressional Affairs, that's talking to Congress. Go ahead. So that's going to be out. Communications and Outreach. It's marketing. Close that one out. Office of the Undersecretary. That's just an office. Close that one out. Okay, now we're on to one. Post-secondary ed. Career and technical. Student aid. Student aid is financial. That has nothing really to do with education. That's just about moving money. And then we have our beautiful one down here, White House initiatives. Well, that's your pet project. Go ahead and cross that one out. Now, look at just how many squares I crossed out, almost half. So all this money goes to Department of Ed, but what's really left? Let's go to an example. Where is the Democrat platform? Where do you see happening anything that we talk about on platform? We don't, because it's building programs, not platform. Go ahead. So then you get this. I'm going to raise teacher salaries $13,500. Really? How? How are you going to do that? Go ahead. Because that is times 3.6 million teachers. Go ahead. Just that alone, if it were straight, would be almost just shy of $50 billion. The whole budget for Department of Ed is $68 billion, and only 67% of it even goes to the states. So we're not anywhere near even having enough money to begin with.
I'd take it
And,
out of defense.
sorry?
I'd take it out of defense.
That's never happened.
That was perfect. That's exactly what gets said too is, I don't think so, because guess what you're doing? Your power is to find how much money you have. Okay, now this doesn't even cover fine print. Go ahead. Fine print. Distribution costs. Now I've got to pay people to even get rid of this. Maybe it's 20%. It might be as high as 50% or double. So now we're talking a whole bunch of money. Go ahead. And I've got to get Congress to approve. So now I've got to get the Republicans to agree with me to even make this happen. What do you think the odds are of that? And furthermore, if you're arguing with Congress on this one issue, what else are you not doing? Because how much time and energy are you going to do that when you have all these millions of people to oversee? Next one. You'd have to reduce the overall education budget. What are you cutting? We barely have enough for education now. What are you cutting in order to make this happen? Next one. And this is my favorite. Let's say you get all that right. Guess what? The folks running for governor next in every state are going to say, I'm going to reduce taxes because I'm going to have a reduced budget, and they're going to equalize it out. So even all your efforts will be for naught no matter what, because somebody else has something to gain by adjusting to that. Next slide. I call this the faster horse problem. What we frequently see from people who are running for office is this kind of a recommendation. The joke is that if Henry Ford had asked everybody what they wanted, they all would have said, I want a faster horse. But in fact, you needed an automobile to truly change the way transportation works. And not only did it affect transportation, that change then affected commerce, affected jobs, affected social structures. It affects everything. You can't just look at everything the same way and think you're going to do more of it. The true person who can change this system has to look at it as a whole. Next slide. So, what do? Go ahead. This is a concept that we came up with on the inside. And I say we because if you do look at this book, you'll see that there are a number of people that participated. We looked at 179 innovation groups inside government. Bet you didn't know there was that much innovation happening. It is in fact found that innovation is credited with 60% of our economic growth in this nation over the history of our country. Innovation is huge. It is primarily paid for out of defense and energy, but it is in every department, every agency, and we tracked them all. And the number one thing that came out of it was, let's work together. Because when we work together and we get that information moving, we change the system. Go ahead. So, first thing you got to do is you got to flatten that hierarchy. It does not have to be a top-down structure anymore. Go ahead. It is the case that you can think of everybody as a piece of the puzzle, each one having a job, but a complementary job instead of a decision-making requirement job. So you still have your president, VP, and cabinet, but you think of their role as one complement to the rest of it. Think of it like a football team. They're the coach, but they don't have every player on the squad. Go ahead. And then, of course, you've got Congress, but Congress is connecting versus working against. Go ahead. American service, this is something I'm really, really passionate about. We saw this in every country I went to overseas. It can be military service, but it can be civilian service, and it can be volunteer service like all of you all are doing. We need to connect this. This is the way that we change this system, and it doesn't take Congress. It takes us to put in our energy. Go ahead. FFRDC, I bet nobody's ever heard of that. That's a federally funded research and development center. These are funded by the government, but they are independent. And so they are this hybrid space, and there is a lot of opportunity to do work there because you can actually affect how money moves without it going to contractors. You can affect ideas that move upward and downward. You have the ability to speak in ways you don't in either industry or in government. Go ahead. And public-private partnerships. We need a lot more of those. That's when we use those boards usefully, like they make sense. We create that advisory, become more of a facilitative body than a regulatory one. Too many rules, it doesn't end up regulating fairness. Go ahead. Oh, and international teammates, of course. I use the word teammates. I actually did not come up with this. This is with many of my colleagues and delegates from other countries, and we talked a lot about how we could better work together. And there was something I found that was really important as we go into this digital age. The smaller countries are more agile. Literally, we were in Switzerland. My colleague was telling them about some stuff that needed to be done and was going to affect their privacy laws. So they just brought the lawmakers to the meeting and changed the laws right then and there. Now imagine what they can test that we should observe. Imagine what we can learn from them. Did you know that the generals in Denmark all have PhDs because their education is commensurate with their rank? Now, maybe they're not necessarily best suited for all parts of the military, but maybe when we all work together, we actually can optimize. Go ahead. Get a seat at the table. This is the number one for all of us here. How do we get more people in? We think about getting people to run for Congress, and I love it. I'm glad that there are so many initiatives happening there. And we ask people, why are you running for president? Not realizing it's the only job you can run for. You can't apply for VP. You can't apply for a job as an appointee. So if you run here, guess where you might land? And then, what about helping people get into this space? Get onto this space. Get into this space. We are not thinking as a party strategically. We're focused here. We're focused here. What we need to be focused is all the way up and down the chain. Yes, sir?
Aren't all the people running for president actually trying to get in these other positions?
That is the argument I often give, yes. Yes, that is exactly. So you'll notice as you listen to them, they each have something that's important to them, right? So what's my favorite? Mine is education and military. I work with the strategic military and education. We have one other person talking about military, Tulsi. Certainly Mayor Pete has had experience, but like you, ma'am, he's not worked at that strategic level, neither has Tulsi. So it's a very different animal. But you've got folks out of Washington who are talking about what? Environment. You've got folks who are talking about the legalities of certain things, or people that are talking about financial pieces. Everybody is starting to name their preference. And the wisest thing we could do as a party is say, everybody at the table comes.
Exactly. Whoever wins has a great team of rivals to fit.
That is the strategic and wise way to do it. Yes, yes. It would be amazing to do that. And so that's my hope, is that we start having that, but that is not traditionally the way we've operated. And what everybody is seeing in the news is the assumption that this is going to be a battle. And what I'd really love to see is it be more of a complement. But it means we have to support people, even those we don't think that are in tier 1. We have to look at tier 1 through 4 probably, because if we can fill all of these spaces, I mean, 4,000 appointees, we don't have 4,000 people applying for these jobs. So we should be supporting all of them so they can get there. And we've got to look at this GA scale and recognize, let's get people to apply for those jobs. Let's help them know how to get there. Next slide. So, I'm making my point here. Go ahead. We need to be applying there and there. Keep going. And there and there. That's a lot of blue. The next thing we need to do is translate. So what ends up happening, next slide. I'm going to read some of this to you because it's actually really important. The Department of Education does not endorse curricular practices or policies. Why? Does anyone know why?
It's local?
No. It's unethical. It's considered unethical. So now think about that. All that research we're paying for and all that information, and they're not allowed to share it all directly. So what do they do instead? Go ahead, next slide. And this is true across all departments. This is just an example from defense. These are, they keep going and going and going and going. These are all of the documents that start getting written, but how many of you read them? How many teachers do you think, because we have the same thing in education as this, right? How many think the teachers are sitting around reading all these crazy things? I literally, in dealing with, because I deal in lifelong education, I had one about funding. It was justification for funding preschool education nationwide. It was 600 pages. You want to know how many people were reading that? Nobody. You want to know how many people read it in defense? I'm pretty sure I was the only one. I'm sorry? Well, and that's it, right? And I am a nerd. And there's an actual term for it. We call it the research practice gap. It's all people researching, but it doesn't actually get to the practitioners. Why? Because they are not involved in the process. So we need to create that communication structure and make sure those advisory boards are filled with teachers and are filled with administrators and are filled with people in transportation or whatever your area is. If it's HUD, I would love to have some folks who live in Section 8 housing as part of those discussions. Maybe they're not the expert in coming up with a strategic plan, but they can sure as heck tell me if things are working or not. Everybody has a role in this country, and the person who could change this system is the one that recognizes how we bring those people in. But you have to know the system first. Go ahead. So number 4 is connect. I love this picture because it makes you smile, doesn't it? But this is the point here, national, state to local. We too frequently hear, or at least I hear all the time, why do you want to work at the national level? I said, because that's the way I think. Why don't you just start at the local level? It's very different. But what should be happening is there should be connection. We should be seeing our candidates talking with folks at every level. And every level should want to be talking with candidates at other levels. Because again, what do we end up with? A fabric that works. So the way this is supposed to lay out is time. So the local folks should be dealing with the immediate. Who needs this now and how do we get it to them? The state should be probably in the 3 to 5 years range out. Because what they need to be looking at is across the state, what do we need to be planning? At the national level, we're almost looking 20 years out. It takes so long for big changes to happen in our country. We need those strategic plans way out there. It's a different kind of person that works at each level, not somebody who works their way up. That doesn't make any sense. There are different skill sets, but they must work together. Next one. So, what can we do? Go ahead. Go ahead. So, find your power. Think outside the box. Send that information all the way up. When we are a state that is missing some state leadership in our party, we need to be looking forward. And one of the reasons people ask, well, why in the world would you run for president if you haven't done local politics? I said, why in the world is our state forfeiting the opportunity to have a voice? Think about that for a minute. Our state has nobody representing, speaking at the national level. Why would we forfeit that? We're not even trying. We're forfeiting. Unacceptable. We need somebody who can speak, who knows our state, who knows our locality, and knows what it is that we need to do. And you don't have to win. You have to get in that sphere of influence. Next one. And number 5, and this is one I'm really passionate about, is a culture of innovation. Innovation is not a step in a process. You don't tell people, do step 1, step 2, and then step 3, I want you to talk to other people. And then step 4, I want you to think differently. Go. Now. No. Innovation means changing the whole system. It means listening to people in an entirely different way. This, I can tell you because I've seen the slides, China is kicking our tuchus in this one. Absolutely running beyond us. The way that they are spending their money is on high risk, high reward research. You know what we're doing? We're making sure that we keep everything local. Yeah. We're trying to keep it safe and comfortable for everyone.
They also aren't spending money on the wars.
They aren't?
They are not.
They do it differently, to be fair. To be fair, they've been working on training their cyber kids since, I think it's 81, and we started in like 06, I think. So, I mean, you're just talking worlds apart, and that's a different kind of warfare, right? Getting into that intellectual, psychological, non-co-located warfare space. So they are spending money in defense, it's just in a very different way. But their research military dollars exceeds ours. They are passing us.
For research, not the total budget at all. It's far less.
Got to stay out of those. They don't get into the same spaces that we do. And of course, that derails into a whole nother conversation, but I'd love to go there. Yes, ma'am.
Well, piggybacking on this, we're going to see wars fought in a whole different way, I think.
Yes.
So what you're talking about is cyber.
Yes.
Grids.
Yes.
Solar energy takedowns and other things that are all computer generated, right?
Correct. The term in military is non-co-located warfare, which means that you are not located in the same space as the other person. And so, yes, it is getting into what I call intellectual and psychological warfare. And it's one of the reasons that I am very interested in the strategic military that is coming, because that's a space I work in. My specialty is cognitive weaponry. And it's really about understanding how we accelerate the capabilities of the mind combined with the computer. It's called human-computer interaction. When you put those together, you create a greater power to be able to defend. But it is a different set of weaponry for sure. And it's what we're finding is a 60% failure rate for basic cyber, which is extremely problematic. We can't get the kids to come in. So now you're talking about all kinds of talent management changes as well. It's pretty complex what needs to occur. But defense is keen on working on it. It's just, it requires stability and understanding of what needs to happen. And that's been challenging under changes in administrations. Go ahead. So, a couple of quick questions. Just go ahead and line these up. Go ahead and run through them, just because we're short on time. So a couple of things that I hope you all will think about is, number one, the system. How do we get people into the government solution space? And we've done all this great work on helping, and especially women, run for office. How do we get to think about other opportunities? So your question about young people, this is where we start talking about it. What is the next generation? There are actual conferences that exist for next generation government, but we have, Stephanie Murphy said only 6% of govies, that's what we call the people who work in government, 6% of govies are under 30. It's been named as one of the major issues that young people are not applying to government, because why in the world would they want that job? We have to make it fun, we have to make it interesting, we have to make it innovative, we have to actually change the structure. We have to encourage, yep.
My son, the one who's moving to Seattle, leaving his mother.
No bitterness.
No bitterness at all. He did a paid internship
Yes.
with a government agency.
Good.
It led to a job. He has graduated with no student loans because of that job.
Yeah.
Says that he would chew glass before he worked for the government. That was enough for him.
That was enough. So he was lucky enough to get a paid internship. What I will share with all of you is I was able to find a number of unpaid internships, many of which are virtual, which means any of you could participate. And the way we get around the rule of not donating your time, you get credit. Doesn't really matter if you're in school, you just get credit if you want it. But you could participate in a 4 to 6 month virtual internship and be part of that decision-making space. And there's a number of them that exist, and it's everything from NASA to overseas work with delegates and with embassies, so and everything in between. And there's a number of these that exist. So that's another place where we could get people in. But yeah, I bet his experience, even if he doesn't want to go back, is invaluable. He understands what's on TV. He understands what the problems are.
Well, yeah. Because it was in that, oh God, what you were talking about earlier, the virtual shit.
Yeah.
Stuff.
Yeah. How do we get people to the table? We've got to open our aperture. We've got to stop worrying. Can you in, can't you in? We've got to look at tiers 1 through 4 and encourage people to get into more spaces. This is how we make change. So we got to think about, who do we look around and say, wow, I think you should be applying for jobs. How do we help them get there? How do we encourage them to do so? Translate. What could we do to give information to those people who have to make those decisions? For those folks down in Puerto Rico, the guy down at the poor schmuck at the end who's having to make the final decisions, how do we get him some information? Maybe we can't do it through direct
How do you find
means.
out who he is?
That gets into who you know. So there's short-term and long-term, right? Short-term, it gets into who you know. And making public the things that are needed, but in a very clear message. So from an activism perspective, it is, what are your top 5? And make sure every single group is saying the same thing, so that when that person turns on TV, they hear the same message every time. So it's almost marketing, right? And the second, the long-term position is, how do we get folks? I mean, how many folks from Puerto Rico are represented in those spaces? Probably not very many.
Not enough.
Not enough. That's right. And so how do we get them into those spaces so that when this happens, we do know who to call and connect to? So those connections, how do we make sure that our local, our state and our national are connecting together. First one is to make sure we have a voice come out of this state. And that means in politics, but also in those places, right? I mean, every time I was going overseas, I was talking about Orlando. Every time I was in DC, I was talking about Orlando. That matters. How do we keep that going? And then the last one is innovation. So I actually listed some things here. I bet nobody knows what a citizen project is. There's actual money set aside. If you've got an idea and you want to make it happen, you can apply for money and they'll pay you to do it for a year. And you can connect it to people. Yeah, so I mean, this money exists. Grants, contracts, projects, small business loans, small business innovation research programs. All these exist, but you know what? If you don't know the game, you don't know to apply for them. That's why this information is so valuable to everybody in our party. We are generally thought of as the ones who are trying to come and speak value and speak about humans and speak for people. I don't know that we're being as strategic as we could be, though, because there's all this here, and it's well known in DC, but it's not as well known in the other parts. We have only a few more minutes. We got through it. Go ahead to the last one. I think I have one last slide. There's my little picture. That's my goal, is to build a nation that is ready for all of these things. What questions can I answer for you? Let's turn on the light. Woo!
Whoa.
I know, that'll get you, won't it?